How can we step forward from down dog? Well, this stepping forward transition is very common in our yoga practice, but it's also a very challenging transition, and it's really a tough one for many yoga practitioners. So today, I wanted to offer some tips and suggestions for how you can maybe improve and move closer to a smoother and a more controlled down dog step forward. And the plan for today is for this video to have 4 sections. The first section is going to be just a quick note about body proportions and how they play a role in this transition. The second section will be about modifications for stepping forward, like how you might make slight changes to make the movement more accessible. The third section is technique tips for the step forward so that you can work to improve the down dog step forward that you're already doing. And then our final section will actually be tips for how to improve your step forward in the long term. And that's going to be in the form of actual strength work that you can do to improve how well your muscles can produce force in order to make that step forward happen. And that's a little more of like a long-term way that we work toward that. So that is the content of this video, and let's get started by taking a look at the quick body proportions thing. So here's a quick point that I just like to make about body proportions when it comes to the down dog step forward transition. So when we step forward like that, we will naturally have an advantage in the step forward if we are a body which happens to have like a longer arm length compared to tibia length or lower leg length. So as you can see, like kind of from the front here, if I had just stepped forward from my down dog, if this length of my limb was longer, like say I was up on fingertips, or I just naturally had a longer arm, I would have more room to make clearance for the step forward because my arm would be, relatively longer than the tibia. But if I have relatively shorter arms, see how I'm kind of compressed here? All of this is kind of congested. And that's just going to make the step forward just naturally a little more challenging. So this definitely is not to suggest that if you don't have the body proportions for the step forward, you might as well not try to improve. It's not that at all, but just to point out that based on our own like limb length proportions, some people will have a little more of an advantage in the step forward and others may have more of a disadvantage. But generally that disadvantage isn't something that we can't, overcome or work toward overcoming. So there's generally room for positive change, but just to keep a little awareness to that arm compared to tibia, especially if you happen to be a yoga teacher and you have students and you're teaching them, we just want to be aware of different bodies and the way that different body proportions can affect how well someone may be able to perform a transition. And that might just inform like our language that we use or the way that we teach these movements, just to be more accessible and inclusive. Let's take a quick look at some modifications for the down dog step forward. And this is mostly just to suggest that it's really not important and it doesn't matter if we actually embody in our body a smooth, controlled down dog step forward like today or ever. We might have that as a goal, and I think it's a great thing to work toward if you want to. But if you're not interested, it is totally fine to step forward to down dog in a number of ways that we might consider like a modification of the step forward that this overarching video is working toward. So a first way that you might modify your down dog step forward, and that you would know that this is a completely fine thing to do, is that maybe you step forward as far as you can step. Maybe it's like to there or so. And then you wriggle your foot or use your hand to step your foot up. And from there, you come up into your pose. So that kind of scooch forward of the foot is a completely fine and great way to modify the step forward. And then so we have 3 total modifications here. Here's number 2. Another great way to modify the step forward is to bring your knees down first and then step forward and then come up into your pose. That is a perfectly acceptable way to also step forward from down dog. And then our third modification for the down dog step forward is to elevate our hands up higher. Because if you remember back to the body proportions talk, remember that if you have a longer arm compared to your tibia, that's going to give you more space, more clearance. So you can give yourself longer arms by placing your hands on yoga blocks. And then hands on blocks, we're in down dog and we step forward, and we generally find that we can do a much more controlled and a further step forward when we add that elevation. So those are 3 great ways to modify the down dog step forward, and they are all excellent. Now let's say that we actually want to work on improving the down dog step forward that we're already doing. I have 3 technique tips that you can integrate in order to make this transition a little smoother and a little more controlled. So the first technique tip would be to actively protract your shoulder blades when you come into the step forward. So we may know we have shoulder blades on the upper back, and they can retract, so they pull toward each other, and they can protract and broaden on the back. And when you have your hands down, as we do in the down dog step forward, retract, protract. So if I show you that from the front, you might be able to see that if I retract, I actually move my chest closer to the floor, and that's going to make a narrower distance between my torso, my chest, and the floor. But if I protract, I lift up away from the floor, and this effectively makes my arm longer. So as we talked about when it comes to body proportions, if you happen to have a longer arm compared to tibia, that's going to give you an advantage in the step forward. Well, you can create a longer arm for yourself by protracting, which involves actively pressing the floor away through your arms. So protract is my first tip for giving yourself, improving your technique for that step forward. My second technique tip for improving your down dog step forward is to not be afraid to let one wrist lift up off the floor in order to help you as you step forward. So again, we know now that longer arms give us an advantage, and we get that through shoulder blade protraction, which we definitely want to be doing, but we also can make our arm effectively longer if we simply lift it up a little bit, like lift the wrist up, which that creates more space here. So that just looks something like this. You go to step forward, and then you lift up, and then you step. And I only lifted the wrist of the hand on the side of the leg that's stepping forward. I didn't need to do that on both sides. Just a little lift on that one side is a great way to make a little space and to make this transition a little more smooth. My third technique tip for improving your down dog step forward is to not be afraid to let your knee angle out slightly wide as you step forward. So sometimes I think we have the idea that when we step forward, we have to bring that knee just straight forward through center. But for many people, so not necessarily everyone, but for many people, when they're in hip flexion, so that's this, like hip flexion is thigh closer to chest, they actually find more comfort and more range of motion if they let the knee go out a little bit. So, you might see that, for example, in a squat. Sometimes we find, and again, it's not everybody, but a lot of people find that a narrow squat like this just feels kind of compressed through the front of the hips. Like their body might not like to go there as much. But if they let their feet go wide and their knees go wide, then suddenly they're comfortable here. This is often a way to give yourself more range of motion in hip flexion. Just let things go wide. So when you go to step forward from your down dog, well, let's see, maybe I'll show it from this angle. That would just, maybe look something like, instead of straight through center, which that's going to be kind of tough, maybe let your knee angle out wide and then step forward. And that angling out wide can just give you more range of motion in your hip joint to make that step forward more accessible. So those were some great technique tips to consider implementing to optimize the down dog step forward that you're already doing. But let's turn our attention now to 3 ideas that I have for improving your step forward more in a long-term sense. And this has to do with actually building strength in your body to help improve that movement. So as we saw with that last tip about letting the knee go out a little wide, so that for many people that helps make more space in the hip joint. That's a little more about mobility. So that's like a tip to improve mobility. But when we step forward, there's also a lot of strength involved in that movement. And so working to improve our strength is a great tip for the down dog step forward. We especially need strength in our hip flexors, which are these muscles that cross the front of the hip, and they perform that active hip flexion. But when it comes to building strength, that's not something that happens instantaneously. We don't do that like within the span of one yoga class. We don't like strengthen our hip flexors toward the beginning of class and suddenly they're stronger and that helps our down dog step forward in that yoga class. It's not short term like that. Strength training is more long term. So we do it regularly over time. And then over time, our muscles adapt, our nervous system adapts, and we can then grow stronger. So I have 3 strength exercises that I would suggest for helping to improve your down dog step forward in the long term. My first tip for building strength to improve your down dog step forward is to use yoga blocks. And I showed a little earlier in this video a way to use yoga blocks as a modification for the down dog step forward to like make it less challenging. But here we're actually going to use the yoga blocks to make it more challenging and to hopefully build some strength in the hip flexor and the core region. So the idea here is that many times when we're not using blocks, we don't have as much space, and therefore in order to get the foot forward, we step it forward pretty quickly, like with momentum, we kind of swing it forward. And when we do that, that's not really building strength. There's nothing wrong with stepping forward that way. It is totally fine. But if we always step forward that way, we are never moving like slowly and with enough control, and it's not challenging enough in this end range position where we need it to be in order to build the strength that we would want to build. So from time to time, you might like to work with this exercise where hands come up on blocks and then we step forward, but then instead of, rushing it and swinging, we really intentionally go slow, slow, slow. And even when the shoulders are forward, consider lifting the knee a little higher. Then you should really feel your core and hip flexors. Then when we actually step the foot, this is tough, but try to set the heel down first before the ball of the foot. And that's just a little like tip for when you set the heel down first, the thigh has to be higher and that requires the hip flexors to work more. So the idea here is that we use the blocks to give us the space to slow down and to actually work to build strength. And if you were to like repeat several step forwards in a row with your hands on blocks, that might be considered like in a strength training setting, that would be like a set of reps or something. And then you would want to do that regularly over time. But that would be a good way. This is a good way, hands on block step forwards that are slow and controlled. That's a great way to build some strength to improve your step forward in the long term. My second tip to build strength to improve your down dog step forward is with something called a low lunge hip flexor lift. And this is something you can actually do at the wall. And then I'm going to show a progressed variation where we bring the hands a little lower than that. But the lift off at the wall would look something like, so this is my low lunge position, hands come on the wall. And then I push into the wall. So you kind of picture that's like down dog and we're pushing as we step forward, but instead we're up and we're pushing into the wall. And then we will lift this front foot up off the floor and set it back down. And we do this with control, lift and lower. We do that several times and we're targeting the hip flexors on that leg. So if you find that the upright low lunge with the hands on the wall maybe isn't challenging enough, then you can bring your hands down lower. And I would suggest blocks on the tallest height. So here we're in a low lunge, hands on blocks. And then I'm gonna move the blocks back here just so you could see. Ideally, I might have them more in line with the foot, but just for the sake of demonstration, then we lift and lower here. And we're pushing into the block. So the same way we push into the wall, we push into the blocks. And then the cool thing about the blocks is that as you find that you build strength, you can always lower them. And then the lower you come, the harder it is. And just lower down, lower down. So that's another great way to build strength in your hip flexors to support the down dog step forward. My third strength tip to support your down dog step forward in the long term is with something called a band resisted knee tuck. So here's the deal. For this one, you actually would need a resistance band. And you would anchor the band around just some heavy object. I've got mine anchored around a heavy kettlebell, but you could also use like a heavy sturdy table leg or a stairway railing if it was sturdy, something like that. Or, if you were in the gym and you had a squat rack, you could loop the band around one of the squat rack legs, something like that. So once you've got your band anchored, then you would loop the band around your ankles. And you want a good distance between you and the anchor point, just so that you create enough tension on the band. Then we lie back, and this is the knee tuck part. So we pull our knees up and we tuck them in toward our chest, and then we straighten again. All the while we're pushing the low back down into the floor to engage the core. But what the band offers that's really great is it gives us the most resistance up here where the knees are pulling in. So we get a lot of resistance from the band up here in that hip flexor shortened position, which is the same hip flexor position when we're stepping forward from down dog. So a normal knee tuck, if you were to lie back and do these, something like these, this is great, but it's not loading the hip flexors in that shortened range, not as much. It's kind of more about, once the leg is longer and more forward. But by adding the band, we get to load the hip flexors really through the full range. But the band helps with that kind of end range strength, which really has some good carryover to the down dog step forward. Now, ultimately, to build strength for your down dog step forward, all of these exercises I presented here are great, but I think it's best when they're done in the context of a greater strength training program that's done like outside your yoga practice as a great way to supplement and complement your yoga practice. And if you're interested in that, I have a whole business that I co-founded with Travis Pollan, an exercise science professor. And that's called Strength for Yoga. And we have lots of different options of strength programs to help support yogis in their actual yoga practice. So links to that are in the caption here. And then just in general, if you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel here on YouTube so that you can stay up to date on all of the content that I share.